Welcome back to the Popperian Podcast, the podcast where we look into the life and the work of the philosopher Karl Popper. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and we have a really interesting podcast today. We're going to be speaking about the Open Society. We're going to be speaking about New Zealand and Karl Popper's attack on Plato and how justified it was. We're going to speak heavily about freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And of course, what makes the podcast so interesting this week is our guest. This is James Kierstead, Senior Lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington. James, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So being in front of me right now, I have a wonderful article of yours called Karl Popper's Open Society and Its Enemies and Its Enemies. And it really is a fantastic look, not just into the work of Karl Popper, but that particular attack on Plato. And it starts with questions about New Zealand, which we're going to get into heavily today, which is really interesting as well. So I might start actually with a question and a personal anecdote that you put in this article. And it starts, I believe, when you were back in Stanford and you are at an interdisciplinary seminar on ancient political thought. And you mentioned to everyone in attendance that you're about to move to New Zealand. So I might get to start with that anecdote because I think it's a really interesting way to open up the question of Karl Popper and how deeply attached he is to New Zealand in some ways.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, that anecdote, it probably sort of become exaggerated in recollection, but, I was sitting there, we were having dinner after a political theory workshop, and we were trying to think of, famous New Zealanders, which is sort of easier to do in the UK than it is in the States. I think in Britain, there's a bit more knowledge of New Zealand. But I think I'm the one who brought it up. I mean, I happen to know that Popper had been in New Zealand, and in fact, he'd written The Open Society and Its Enemies in New Zealand. And so I mentioned Popper, and, it wasn't the case that everybody around the table suddenly started, laying into the guy, trashing Popper. But I think the reaction was pretty typical of the way that Popper is received in the academy, really, in certain sections of the academy in particular. I'd say that within classics, the attitude to Popper is still a little bit hostile in an academic sense. There were a couple of philosophers, Platonists, around the table who, weren't particularly keen. And I thought it was interesting that the one person sitting there who was really keen and was eager, enthusiastic about Popper, was a Chinese exchange student who was actually translating my advisor's book. This is Josiah Ober, who's a great historian of classical Athens and of classical Athenian democracy. That was my advisor. And his book, Democracy and Knowledge, is all about how democracy is about aggregating knowledge from different sorts of people. And anyway, this Chinese exchange student was translating his book. I don't know if this translation has come out yet. I should have a look. But anyway, he was the one who said, no, I think Popper is very important because I'm active, in the pro-democracy movement in China. And one of the things that Popper emphasized was we're always free to make our own fate, right? So this is Popper against historicism, this idea that there's a historical inevitability to things, that history is like a tram rather than a bus, as Gilbert Ryle says, right? So it can just go in one channel, it can't go anywhere. So this particular exchange student was quite inspired by that vision of Popper's. And I should say as well, we'll probably get into this later, but I don't think that the reservations that some classicists have about Popper are completely bizarre. I think that in some ways he's a thinker when we're talking about intellectual history who got a lot of the details right, a lot of the details wrong, but got the basic ideas right. His basic ideas were often very strong and clear. And I think that, when his book came out, people took a lot of issue with the individual details. And in some ways they were right to, but I'm not sure that it knocked down the entire thrust of his project.
Well, we will get into it, I promise. And there's another interesting part that we should start before we dive into those questions about Plato and Popper. And I might start with a quote here, because you are in New Zealand. You've been living there for a number of years now. And of course, you have a very interesting podcast, which I'm going to link below, called Free Kiwi. So you certainly seem to care about the country in significant ways. So I might get you to explain how Popper came to New Zealand, but I might also put a quote here that you have in your article. And this is Popper writing after he arrives in New Zealand. And he writes, "It's not quite the moon, but after the moon, it's the farthest place on earth." So he has this certainly a feeling of being in exile when he is in New Zealand, but he also has wonderful things to say about it. He believes that the actual form of governance down there that he saw was quite impressive, at least relatively to the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that anybody who comes to New Zealand, even nowadays, still has this experience of like, wow, I really am in the last place on Earth. I mean, you go any further and you get to Antarctica.
Yes.
And sometimes when flying was still a thing, I would fly back, and I would change planes in Sydney. And no offense, but for someone who spent a lot of my life in England, in the Northern Hemisphere, Sydney seems like a long way away. And then
it is
another 3-hour flight from Sydney. You think, oh my goodness, where have I come to? But of course, when Popper was doing it, he wasn't taking flights. He was taking ships, and it would take a really long time. And as he says in his autobiography, Unended Quest, in those days, in the 1940s, it would be 3 months before you could get a letter back. So even mail would take 3 months. And of course, there wasn't the internet in those days. And I think that he had a lot of good things to say about the country looking back in his old age. And I think it was a wonderfully peaceful place for him to work. And I also think, the most important thing that needs to be remembered is, and I'm sure Popper remembered this himself, is that he fled Vienna. He was a Jewish intellectual in Vienna in the 1930s. And that's, it wasn't a nice place to be, obviously. And so he left Vienna, I think, in 1937. March 1937, I believe. A year later, I think, was Anschluss, and then we have Kristallnacht, which is when hundreds of synagogues, I think around 100 synagogues in Vienna alone, were destroyed through sort of anti-Semitic rage, just in Vienna. So he came to New Zealand, and because he was able to come to New Zealand and got this lectureship at what was then the University of New Zealand at Canterbury, which is now Canterbury University, he was able to escape all that. So that's all that is worth bearing in mind. But on the other hand, he was in this very small college at the time. It was really just a part of the greater University of New Zealand, and the research environment for him. This is one of the things that when I've talked to New Zealanders who kind of knew people who knew Popper, comes out very strongly. The research environment was kind of non-existent. In fact, it was sort of hostile. The environment was sort of hostile to research. The view was, you're here to teach. You're not here to write books. I think that's a quotation attributed to one of Popper's superiors at Canterbury College at the time. And there was basically this attempt to stop him doing research because he was spending all his time writing this book. And the library at the time, I think David Cohen, a New Zealand journalist that I interviewed for my podcast, he was saying that they had one philosophical journal, which was mine, which was a good one for the time, but it wasn't a great library. And I've read some scholarship recently, some Italian scholarship about Popper, saying, he's mistranslated a few phrases of Thucydides, and it seems like the reason that he's mistranslating these phrases is because he doesn't have access to the right books. So anyway, it's kind of a heroic effort in more ways than one, the Open Society and its enemies, because he's writing it as an exile, as the world is being plunged into absolute darkness. His people, his fellow Jews, are being horribly persecuted. There's an act of genocide against them, and he's here in this faraway place with not that many resources at his disposal, with very few allies, very few intellectual allies, and he just sort of gets it done. And his wife and he are growing vegetables to supplement his income, and Henny, his wife, is helping him type the manuscript, and he's sending it to his friend Ernst Gombrich in Europe, and he's trying to get it out, and eventually, of course, he does.
There's a wonderful quote in your article here, which I hadn't heard before. And it is his wife there talking about those years where she's growing vegetables and writing up his manuscripts. And she calls it the nightmare years. But I might start with a very interesting another part. So the really interesting part about your article is also the deep understanding of the reception of Karl Popper's book when it does come out. I'm going to start with a couple of quotes here, but I'll let you get into it in much more detail. First one is from Bertrand Russell, and he says, I'm shortening it down here, a work of first-class importance. And then it runs on to Eric Vogelin, and he starts like this: Popper is not able even approximately to reproduce correctly the contents of one page of Plato. So before we get into all those details about where Popper may or may not have got Plato right and wrong, I might get to talk about the reception that this book took when it first came out, because I listening to your podcast in preparation for this one, I also heard that he struggled to get it published for a number of years, which I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I think Popper, he'd written Logik der Forschung, which is translated as the logic of scientific thought or something like that. It was translated only some 15 years later. So he'd written one book, and he was known in Vienna among this small circle of logical positivists, but he wasn't amazingly well known. So you have this not particularly well-known thinker who presents a 2-volume work with dense endnotes on historical thinkers. So yeah, he struggled to get it published, and when he did, there were various different reactions. And as you say, Eric Vogelin and Leo Strauss in Chicago, they were not particularly impressed. I think that Vogelin, in the same letter, he describes the book as a scandal without extenuating circumstances. But I think this is key to the way that classicists reacted, and I think is quite revealing of their mindset at the time. And I think that it was quite, Plato was still venerated in certain circles. And I talk in the article about various figures in English classics in particular who would go around saying, we need to constantly reread Plato's Republic in order to tell us how to educate young people today. And I think a lot of those claims seem very strange nowadays, but Plato was really up there in the canon of thinkers. And so Popper attacking him in this way, it didn't go down too well. Now, I mean, there's a whole range of classicists and political theorists who responded in what I'd call a sort of cool and reserved way, but nonetheless engaged him in argumentation. I mean, the Vogelin reaction is at the extreme end, but I think a lot of people were sort of, we're not too sure about this, we have to criticize it. And I think one reviewer said, it is precisely because Popper seems like such an able man that his book must be criticized and not too lightly, because otherwise he's going to get away with spreading this false image of Plato. But on the other hand, there were thinkers like Bertrand Russell, as you say, Gilbert Ryle, all of whom received the book quite warmly. And in fact, I think with Russell, it was one of those things where Popper sort of took something that a lot of people were already sort of thinking, and he cast it in extremely persuasive and forceful form. And so people like Russell, who were already, I think, sort of having doubts about the Republic as a political tract, that helped them sort of flip. And it's quite amusing that Russell, in one of his essays, he sort of says, well, of course, the fact that Plato's Republic has been admired on its political side by men through the ages is a sign of how powerful literary snobbery is, or something like that, right?
Well, there is, if I might jump in, actually, there's something else I might add to that, actually, and this is something else that comes through your article, but as well as something in your podcast, and something that I find quite amusing. I quite like this about Popper, and he was a horribly prickly person to deal with, it seems. And his writing is, you write here that his prose was inflammatory and aggressive, and it was certainly not in the style that people were used to of the day. So it wasn't just that he was attacking this venerated figure in Plato who no one dared attack, certainly not in those terms, but he was doing so in a way that was very unusual and hard for people to get their head around.
Yeah, and I should have said as well that it's not the case that he was the first person to attack Plato, and in fact, there were people in the 1920s and 30s, so Crossman, the British MP, and others and Albert Hornley, who was a lecturer in South Africa, German-born, English-educated intellectual. Those people actually attacked Plato in even harsher terms in the 1930s, actually saying that Plato was a Nazi. And I think they sort of overcooked it to a certain extent. It was quite easy for people defending Plato to say, come on, you're going a bit too far. The Callipolis in the Republic isn't literally Nazi Germany. You know, it's not exactly the same as Nazi Germany. Plato probably wouldn't actually have been a Nazi because, you know, there's no worship of war. He's not a relativist. He's not some kind of Nietzschean relativist, etc. So there are differences. And I think one of the reasons that Popper was so effective was because he actually was relatively moderate. He was both forceful, but he also took it down a notch with respect to the people who'd come before. And I think that's one of the things that's often forgotten, because I think because his book became easily the most prominent attack on Plato, classicists especially tended to look back at it and say, oh yeah, Popper, he was the guy who said that Plato was just a fascist. Not quite. It was more that he was saying that Plato was an authoritarian or a totalitarian in the same tradition as Hegel and Marx. And so he cast it in a tradition of anti-democratic thought, rather than just saying, as people like Hornley and Crossman had been trying to say, look at this. This is you know, Plato's Republic is like a handbook for Nazis in a very direct sense. And it was the case that there were some German scholars, actual Nazi scholars, who made those claims. But, you know, they weren't very influential, and there weren't very many of them. So I think that, you know, Popper's view was more influential precisely because it was a little bit more realistic, while still being quite polemical and forceful.
If Popper hoped for the open society, the enemy of this is the closed society, and the tribal society, I believe, was the phrase he often liked to use. And there's a quote here that you say there are several reasons to be slightly embarrassed by this quote of Popper. And this is an interesting way to get into Plato, I think. And the quote goes like this: the early Greek tribal society resembles in many respects that of the people like Polynesians and the Maoris, for instance. So he's making this claim about early Greek society and the society around Plato. And he is making a claim, I believe, about Plato, that that Plato is hoping to wind it back to tribalism. So I might get to explain what tribalism is for Popper, and how he saw that in Plato's ideas inside the Republic.
Yeah, it's complicated. I don't really know what tribalism is. I mean, it can mean so many different things. Of course, in ancient Greece, there's this added complication that we have these things called tribes. Sometimes they're sort of natural, atavistic, ancestral organizations, and sometimes they're parts of the city-state that they actually design, and they arbitrarily allocate people to them. So anyway, there's a big debate about tribalism in early Greek history. What I think Popper meant was something much more ordinary in the sense of it was sort of, in inverted commas, primitive stage of development. And what Plato wanted to do was just bring us back to the time when we didn't really think too much about how to organize society, because Popper also talks about how there's an initial stage when you think that all your customs are just natural, and then you get to this later stage where you can actually realize that you can change things, and you can think critically, you can engage in critical rationalism, and you can sort of design how to do things in your society. Now, I think this is one of the weak points of what he's saying about Plato, because it doesn't really seem to be the case that Plato wants to bring Greece back to a tribal era. I mean, if anything, Plato was some kind of utopian radical. I mean, of course, it's true that Plato was an aristocrat and Plato is conservative in various senses. He's not pro-democracy. But the way that he goes about critiquing democracy is to have, various philosophical dialogues and various philosophical claims. But in two of his most clearly political works, the Republic and the Laws, you actually have this sort of utopian planning scheme, right? You have these two ideal states, these ideal polis, these ideal city-states. Callipolis, which is translatable as, the beautiful city, the good city, and Magnesia in the Laws. And he's literally trying to work out what features the city is going to have and how it's going to be organized. And, in some ways it has some features of the archaic Greek city-state. Especially in the Laws, there's a lot of emphasis on education through choruses, singing songs to the gods in a correct way according to Plato. But in other ways, it's a very, very radical system, and there are a lot of features in the Republic and in the laws in these ideal city-states which were not a feature of even the ancient Greek oligarchies of his time or the ancient Greek aristocracies that preceded the democracy that he had to live in. And the biggest example of this is obviously the whole scheme involving the guardians and the philosopher kings. So that idea that you're going to actually train philosophical experts through a sort of mathematical curriculum that leads you to a vision of the form of the good, that's not something that was happening on the ground. So I think that it's a bit strange because I think that Popper also has a lot of good thoughts and a series of salutary attacks, salutary critiques of utopianism. And I think actually his attack would have been better if he focused it on Plato as a utopian radical rather than as some kind of traditionalist wanting to take everything back to a tribal age.
What about that claim at the start when you spoke about trams and buses and these two conceptions about history, which, of course, is a charge that Popper pins on Plato and says he's an historicist and he believes history is bound to end up one way. It's not in our hands. What about that charge? Because you got a really interesting take on this, I believe by Christopher Taylor, who says that this is a mistake in reading Plato, that in fact, this comes back to, you have to first have a grasp on Plato's idea of forms. And Plato had this idea that that all change takes us further away from those perfect forms in some ways. And therefore it's a long-term deterioration. And that's perhaps a way of salvaging Plato from being a historist. So I might actually get you to explain that because I've done a very bad job of it there. But I might explain what that is and what Taylor is trying to defend, or at least partially defend Plato in terms of that.
Okay, so this is one of another point where I think Popper is not on firm ground. So part of the overall argument, the overarching argument of the open society and its enemies is an attack on what Popper called historicism. And obviously, Popper also wrote other things about this, the poverty of historicism, various essays about this idea. And what he thought historicism was precisely this idea of what Isaiah Berlin called historical inevitability, that there was only one way that things would develop. And I think that if you talk about Hegel and Marx in this way as historicists, that's a bullseye blow, right? That's exactly right. This is it's central to Hegel's project. And of course, Marx just says, I'm doing Hegel and turning him on his head. I'm taking Hegel's sort of I'm taking Hegel's sort of spiritual view of historical development and making it a materialistic story. But it's still a story about history and how history tends in one direction. Plato, you can say that Plato's a historicist, but that blow doesn't really land in the same sense. He's not really that interested in history. And one of the reasons is because Plato's philosophy, if you want to boil it down, I mean, really the theory of forms is central to it. And as you say, the theory of forms is a way of thinking about universal qualities. So what is it? So we talk about people being good. We can talk about, I have a good car. That's a really good horse. It's a good football team. What do all these things have in common? And there are various ways of answering these questions, this question. But Plato's answer would be, well, the reason that we call all these things good is because there's this other dimension in which there are these forms of pure goodness and pure beauty and pure, whatever other universal adjective you want to use. And every particular instance of the good partakes of these forms. And so it may have been the case that in the past, so you could imagine, okay, maybe Plato thought that in the past there were these perfect civilizations that, they were perfectly attuned to the form of the good and the form of the beautiful. And then we've fallen off from that. But that's not really what's going on in a lot of these things. And it's not the only option as well. So Christopher Taylor, one of my old professors, points out that it's not the case that, you can only come away from the forms. You can also move towards the forms. So, for example, imagine I'm like a bad person in Plato, thinking about this the way Plato would have. How do I become a good person? Well, for Plato, the way I become a good person is actually by moving closer towards the form of the good. And I move closer towards the form of the good by understanding it better. Because for Plato and Socrates, there's this very intellectual understanding of ethics. If you understand what the good is, then you will automatically do it. Okay, there's a lot of problems there with regard to sort of weakness of will and stuff, but that's basically what they believe. But anyway, the point is that we can actually move towards the form of the good. And so it's not the case that, it's not the case that Plato has to say there was this perfect society in the past and everything else is coming away from it. In fact, again, if we look at the Republic and the Laws, he seems to be recommending, or at least he's doing a very kind of involved thought experiment around the idea that we're going to actually have a new state and we're going to move towards that new kind of state, right? So he's not saying in those books, we need to just go back to the way we were doing things in Athens in the year 600. He's saying we need to completely rethink how to do politics. And to give Plato his credit, I mean, that's partly why he's been such an influential political thinker and such an interesting political thinker, because that attempt to sort of design things from scratch is an attempt that has considerable philosophical interests. It's just that here I think Popper is on firm ground. It's just that that's probably not the best way of thinking about political change, of just let's burn everything down and start from scratch, right? Because there are things involved like people and habits and traditions. But anyway.
Well, there is another part of this that around really interesting here, and this is Popper, again, trying to dig into Plato here. And it's something that is really fascinating, and it plays out well throughout your article. And you write that Popper believes that Plato betrayed Socrates. And of course, that does come out quite strongly in the Open Society. But Popper does not have this same animosity towards Socrates. In fact, he believes that Plato did Socrates a huge disservice here. And he did it deliberately in his own aims. He deliberately distorted Socrates' message for his own philosophical ends. So let's get into that question there and how realistic that charge is.
Yeah, I mean, this is another thing that was criticized even by some of Popper's allies or people who liked the book. Gilbert Ryle, for example. He said something very English about this, like, I myself believe that there's a limit beyond which speculations about others' motives should not be pushed, and he thinks that Popper basically makes this up. And I mean, the problem is that, okay, there's this whole thing in classical studies, one of the oldest questions in classical studies, which is the so-called Socratic problem. And the problem is that Socrates was this incredibly influential philosopher, and he left no written works. So we have the works of Plato, we have the works of Xenophon, and we know of other authors like Polycrates who wrote stuff about Socrates. But, essentially the problem is with Plato, he's always attributing these theories and these words, or almost always in the early and middle periods of his dialogues, he's almost always attributing these theories to Socrates. So what is there that is Socrates' theory, and what is there that's Plato's theory? And there are various answers to this, and I think the most common one, at least in the English-speaking world, is that the first few dialogues are what Socrates would have been like, which is just sort of quite defensive, quite skeptical, not putting forward theories of his own. And then in the middle period, the middle dialogues, we get Plato putting his own theories into Socrates' mouth, and this is the period of the Republic. And then in the later period, the period of the Laws, Socrates actually kind of disappears from the dialogues completely. And probably that's because Plato had kind of fallen out of love with the Socratic way of thinking, and also with the idea that he was going to put his own views into Plato's mouth. So, there's a lot going on there. Did Plato betray Socrates? Maybe you could argue in the late period that he kind of fell out with his teaching, but I mean, the early period, you can read, all the works that are about Socrates' trial and execution, the Euthyphro and the Phaedo and the Crito and the Apology. You can read them as very justificatory, right? They're really works trying to tell the Athenians and trying to explain to people in later ages why the Athenians got it wrong in condemning Socrates to death. They're trying to depict Socrates in a certain way. So I actually think that Plato was, for much of his career, was extremely loyal to Socrates. Now, I think what Popper's doing here is interesting, because I think that it comes out of the Anglophone tradition of liberal thought. And I think here he's reading George Grote, who was a great historian of ancient Greece, and a great sort of liberal historian of ancient Greece. And I think one of the things that happens here is a bit of a strange one. It carries on into the modern day, which is that people kind of come face to face with the with the full horrors, maybe we should put it that way, of Plato's totalitarian systems.
Yes.
And then they sort of think, well, but Socrates is this really cool dude who went around and engaged people in conversation. So that sounds kind of democratic and nice, and he's very open-minded, Socrates. So there's this need to sort of recuperate Socrates and to kind of divide him off from Plato and saying, it's kind of like, I don't know, communists do this with Lenin and Stalin, you know, it's kind of like, this guy was the bad one and we don't want him to infect the other guy. And I don't think Socrates should have been executed, but I think that it's fair to say that, you know, we have a lot of evidence that Socrates was very involved with some of the people who became the 30 tyrants in Athens, people like Critias, who was actually a relative, who was very full-on anti-democrat. In fact, we hear that on Critias's funeral monument, he depicted himself setting fire to the goddess Democritia. So these guys are pretty hard out. So I'm still a little bit skeptical myself about this idea that, you know, Socrates was this sort of pure democrat that was betrayed by Plato.
I might I might introduce something else here that you will likely be also quite skeptical about. This is another interesting argument defending Plato again. And this one, to my ears, and I think to many listeners' ears, will much more quickly think, there is something slightly wrong with this. But I'll get you to open up just how it may or may not be correct. And that is another claim that has been run throughout the years. That is that Plato's texts are just so complex that they cannot be reduced to a single idea in the way that Popper is trying to do.
Yeah, so that's something I spent probably too long on in my essay, but I think it in a way it sort of shows Popper's influence, because I think that what happened after the Second World War is that you find a lot more, it's not completely like a sea change, it never happened before, and now it's happening for the first time, but you find a lot more studies that are stressing the literary aspects of Plato, and the idea that Plato isn't really doing full-on philosophy, he's not sort of giving you philosophical propositions. What he's doing is sort of depicting what philosophy is like. He's writing dramas. Leo Strauss talks about how we should look at it as theater. It's a kind of theater. And there's several schools of thought that emphasize that Plato is really a literary author. And in a way, we're sort of doing violence to his text if we take this very analytical view and just sort of attack his propositions. And I think that shows Popper's influence. This is one of the hypotheses I guess I put forward in the essay, that I think that one of the reasons you get this literary turn in Platonic studies is partly because Popper's attack had been so forceful and so influential that, you know, there's two options. One of them is, if you want to defend Plato, you can say, okay, yeah, you're right that he's a totalitarian, but totalitarian is great, you know. Obviously, like, nobody's going to do that in the 1950s and 60s. And the other option is to say, okay, yeah, there are some ideas in this that are a bit iffy, but you know, that's not the most important thing about Plato. And actually, the thing is, like, you can do this with Plato. It's more of a viable path than with like Kant or someone, or even Aristotle. Who, you know, we know that Aristotle wrote dialogues as well, but we only have his treatises. So with people like Hume or whatever, they're just writing treatises. You can't really say, oh, this is just a literary text. But Plato's writing these dialogues, and there is a lot more going on with these dialogues. And, you know, the Republic is a fascinating case because really the ideal state in the Republic, it's introduced in order to explain the soul, right? There's this whole thing in the Republic, the city-soul analogy. The reason that he starts talking about Callipolis, Socrates starts talking about Callipolis, is in order to explain the nature of justice in the individual human soul. And he talks about the city of Callipolis in order to sort of blow up the soul on a big scale and to be able to explain to you what's happening on the soul on a small scale. So a lot of people have latched onto this and said, oh, we shouldn't even talk about political philosophy in the Republic because it's not really about political philosophy. Now, I think that, I mean, these are interesting and sort of viable paths, but I think that ultimately they fail because there's just so much philosophy in Plato. I mean, that's the thing. They're not really plays. I mean, people have compared them to Shakespeare, but it's not the case in Shakespeare that Hamlet just takes over the conversation and starts telling you about the forms. I mean, Hamlet has some soliloquies that are philosophical, but it's nothing like Socrates. And there's so much time spent in the Republic on this ideal state that it's just very difficult for me to believe that he was introduced only to explain the nature of the soul. I think, to me, it's undeniable he's also doing political philosophy. And we can see that because in the laws, he's pretty much straight up doing the same project of designing an ideal state, but in that case, there's no city soul analogy that allows you to escape. So I think that now we're kind of going back towards this view where Plato is doing political philosophy, and we can respect that. And I think that this is in a way a sort of backhanded compliment that Popper gave to Plato, which is to sort of treat him seriously as a theorist of absolutism. And okay, Popper was hostile to that, and I think we should be. But Plato's a highly intelligent man, and he's defending totalitarianism. And if we want to understand totalitarianism, we need to deal with its most capable critics, most capable proponents.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far, and I apologize for this brief interruption, but I will take this moment to briefly send out a plug for the podcast itself. The Popperian Podcast is something that I've been planning for quite a while, and it's something that I want to keep running month to month. But to do so, it's going to need your help. If you're willing or able or interested, please go to the links below the podcast and support us however you can. It will be your help as listeners that keeps the podcast going and keeps the content coming out, and I thank you in advance. And with that said, we will now return to the second half of the interview. Thanks for listening. Well, let's talk about totalitarianism, and because this is another interesting line within your work here. So as you mentioned at the start, one of the comparisons is consistently made, not just by Popper, but by many other people at the time before Popper, was between Plato and Nazi Germany and the Nazi regime, or fascism in general. And this is not to say that Plato was a fascist, but that his ideas can be linked to fascism. But importantly, you say so there's something slightly missing in here. Totalitarianism and authoritarianism, for example, they're not blanket terms. There are degrees here. There are a whole range of varieties in which totalitarianism can look. And you go on to say that perhaps what we're making a mistake here is looking at Plato's Utopia and thinking it is the most severe type of this, when in fact it might be just a moderate type of totalitarianism. Not a good thing, but still better than what many people are imagining it to be.
Yeah, so this is another point that Christopher Taylor makes in his article that I really recommend. I think it's called "Was Plato a Totalitarian?" And he sort of says, well, there's some evidence that Plato thought, for example, that the point of the ideal state is to make sure that each of the individuals are as happy as possible. So it's not that each individual has to have their desires rigidly subordinated to the state, which is what Taylor thinks extreme totalitarianism would be. But as I say in my piece, I kind of think that these objections, I think Popper would in some ways have been quite happy with, because a lot of these critics like Taylor, they say, okay, Plato's not an extreme totalitarian, he's just a moderate totalitarian. But that's, that gives away kind of a lot. And that's really all Popper would have wanted, I think, is to have people admit that, the vision in the Republic and the laws, more so the Republic, but these ideal states are very authoritarian and or totalitarian visions. And I think that's sort of undeniably correct.
It is also a good little moment to make a little sidestep into freedom of speech and freedom of expression, which of course is something central to your podcast, and it's just that idea of the individual being a subordinate to the collective. So I might get it actually before we jump into this little sidestep. We'll come back to to Plato and Popper just afterwards. But I might get introduce your podcast because it's called Free Kiwis, and I might start here because I did at the beginning have a few lines of Popper denigrating New Zealand as this far off country in the middle of nowhere. But I'm going to put another couple of quotes here that you put from a separate article of yours. And he says, it's also the best governed country in the world. It's decent, friendly, and well disposed. And yet you have a podcast called Free Kiwi. So there must be something that you are slightly concerned about. So let's get into that.
Yeah, I actually think it's sort of interesting because I think there is a major free speech crisis in certain sections of the West at the moment. And I'm concerned about it because it's a terrible thing and people are being bullied, just for their expression, and their rights are being, violated in fairly clear ways, in my humble opinion. But I'm also concerned with it because in some ways it strikes me as an outgrowth of the Anglophone cultures that I grew up in Canada, in England, and in New Zealand, but especially in Canada and New Zealand. I think that actually that very decency that kindness, that tendency to sort of kind of go along and not be too stubborn, that can actually get you into trouble. And I wonder with both Canada and New Zealand especially whether this is becoming part of the problem, that the sort of powers that be say you have to say this and not say that, and I think in places where niceness is so emphasized, it's very easy for everyone to say, oh yes, of course we need to do the right thing, even though you may actually be undermining the foundations of a free society, which are also important things, and also part of the Anglophone tradition, not only the Anglophone tradition, but I mean it's also part of our cultures, and one which I hope to see continue to flourish.
I might add on to that and dig into it a little bit. I imagine some people, I mean, this is a podcast about Karl Popper, so I imagine most people listening will be in full agreement with you. But just to play slight devil's advocate, people might say, why can't we achieve great things, and why can't we solve all the problems that we want to solve and get to the place that we want to get to in life by limiting free speech perhaps a little bit to be a bit more kind? And wouldn't that be a nicer world to be in?
Well, this is one of the things in which Popper is good on, because I think I've listened to a couple of other your podcasts, and they're more about Popper, the philosopher of science, this sort of critical rationalist. And so the way he thinks about science is progressing and knowledge is progressing is, as you know well, conjectures and refutations. So what you do is you put out sort of models of the world, you put out theories, and then you try and shoot them down, or hopefully through the progress of contestation, other people try and shoot them down, and then you get closer to the truth. And this is a certain vision of what science does, but I think that it can also be extended, and I think Popper would extend it to sort of discourse as a whole. So what you want in that situation, if this is the way it works, and I think it is, you want the largest possible amount of conjectures going forward. And some conjectures are going to sound to certain people like they're mean, right? But if you sort of disallow them, then you're actually restricting the number of conjectures that people can put forward. And that might be anything from between sort of unfortunate to disastrous. Unfortunate because it might be that you didn't get the best idea put forward, and you missed the sort of optimal path through the problems that face society. Or it could be disastrous because there's actually a problem facing society that's really great, and because you a priori kind of canceled or ruled out this one way of dealing with it, you've actually plunged society into these very deep, difficult problems that you wouldn't even have had if you just allowed people to put forth views and allowed those views to be discussed. And there's actually an interesting case, because just to the moment, I mean, I know this is still sort of developing and breaking news, but the idea that the COVID virus, for example, came from a lab in China, I mean, that was shut down fairly aggressively by various people, and including various parts of the media. And I mean, I've been reading Nicholas Wade's very detailed paper on this, and at the very least, I would say it is a conjecture that should be entertained, a conjecture that should be put out there to be argued in the public. And if that is right, that this actually was something designed by so-called gain-of-function experiments, where you take viruses and add certain things to them, that's very relevant to how we respond to this virus, how we respond in the future, whether we do this kind of science in the future, what kind of safeguards there are around this sort of science. So, and there are examples of this sort of thing all the time. And I would think by this point in human history, it would be fairly obvious, but apparently it's not.
That's on the same topic. Let's keep getting into this, because I have been listening to a lot of your podcasts throughout the week, and they are really quite interesting. And one topic that has come up a couple of times actually is this interesting idea of the paradox of democracy and the paradox of tolerance. And of course, Popper saw this firsthand in many ways. He saw the German Reichstag hand over power to Hitler in this way. So I might get a touch on that, and just to get into it, because it's not both these paradoxes. I'll get you explain what they are, but I feel out there in the world, and I might get the sense from you as well, that these are things that are not that well understood out there in the broader world.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so the paradox of there are two paradoxes, I guess we might talk about. One is what Popper called the paradox of democracy. The paradox of democracy is simply that you want democracies to be able to vote on anything, However, there's only one case in which democracies should not be able to vote on something, and that is votes on their own existence. And the reason for this is because if they're allowed to vote themselves out of existence, then they no longer exist.
Yes.
So it's a very kind of, I don't know if it's formally a paradox, but my co-host on Free Kiwis, Michael Johnston, who is more of a scientific training, he was sort of comparing it to, things in the philosophy of mathematics, like, the Principia Mathematica, Russell's paradox. People can look that up if they want to go deep into that. But basically, the solution to it is just to sort of create a block on certain types of things that you can say in your system, so it doesn't produce paradoxes. And I think Popper would have recommended basically just don't vote yourself out. Don't have votes on whether the democracy can still exist. Because we know that this happens in history. In Athens in 411, the Athenian assembly voted itself out of existence. There was an oligarchy briefly. And in Germany as well, this is what happens in the Reichstag, that they vote themselves out of existence. And then, of course, again, you've got no democracy. Okay, so that's the paradox of democracy. Then there's the paradox of tolerance, which is basically that you go around tolerating everything anyone does or anything anyone says. But if you do that too much, if you tolerate violence, for example, then you get into the situation where nobody's really tolerating anybody else. Because if you just tolerate thugs going around beating people over the head when there's other people say something the thugs don't like, then people aren't free because they're going to get hit over the head if they say something. So then you have to have safeguards. You have to say, okay, certain types of things you can't do. And then the really interesting question is, where exactly do you draw that line? And I think that Popper kind of threw that out as a paradox in an endnote to the Open Society and its enemies. I don't think that he actually thought about it that much, and that's a bit of a problem. But there is a cartoon that's going around the internet, has been in the past few years, which basically attributes to Popper the view that anything that sounds intolerant, anything that any other group can say is intolerant, you have to shut that down. And I think that that's almost certainly not what Popper was thinking. He would have drawn the line, he would have put the bar a lot higher. In that endnote in the Open Society and its enemies, he talks specifically of people who use their fists and their pistols. So he seems to be talking there about violence. There's a later text where he seems to row back on that slightly and to be talking about just sort of various extreme forms of intolerance. But anyway, I definitely don't. There are various discourses nowadays that people would like to shut down, and they draw on Popper's aid for that. And I don't think that he would have put it there. I mean, you've got to remember, Popper was pretty much directly persecuted for being a Jew. He was very close to being killed in a gas chamber. And if he would wanted to, he could very easily have spent a lot of his intellectual life saying anybody who says anything very nationalistic or very right-wing or even anything slightly anti-Semitic should have their rights taken away and thrown in jail. He didn't say that. And he lived through that experience, So I'm pretty sure he would have defended free speech. And I think that his conclusion, actually, interestingly, what he sort of concluded from the whole experience of Nazism in Europe wasn't that we should shut down certain types of speech, but that we should keep certain types of speech open, precisely what the Nazis didn't do.
There is a really interesting thing that you say, and it's something that it's been sitting in my mind ever since reading Popper. And I think this is a really important point to touch on, because even people that I bumped into who have read Popper and really do understand Popper, they seem to miss this point about Popper's claims about democracy. And it is essentially that the value of democracy is not really in the institution and the law, it's in the culture, it's in us. And this is one of those complaints out there that people say that when, for example, freedom of speech is being shut down, they're saying it's just the politicians or it's just the institutions, without realizing that they are actually mirroring us. These things are being done in our name, and we as the culture are allowing it to happen.
Yeah, that's right. And that's actually one of the things that makes me most sad and crestfallen about this whole sort of cultural change, because I sort of thought that in places like New Zealand and Canada, we would be safe from that kind of thing. I thought we'd sort of grown up as a society enough to realize that it's not just a question of a sort of epistemic development or progress, as Popper would have it. It's also a question of basic respect. You shut people down for saying what they want to say. It's actually kind of bullying, because you may disagree with them, but they may disagree with you. I mean, that's often a symmetrical relationship, or a symmetrical relation, right? If you disagree with someone, they often disagree with you. So they could just as easily try and tell you to shut up, right? But then you would most people would sort of take umbrage at that because they're not being respected, and that's the right response. Then all you have to do is, do this sort of mental exercise. Okay, well, how would they feel if I shut them up? But no, it's completely right. I mean, I think that the legal framework is also important. It's very important that we have laws that protect freedom of expression. It's very important in places like universities that we have formal rules in place to make sure that people aren't deplatformed, or in councils, for example, it's happening again in Christchurch, where Popper once lived, that people are being shut down and not being able to speak about certain issues. But beyond that, it's also important on a personal level to just sort of give people a little bit of space, and just sort of try to assume goodwill on the part of other people that they may believe something different to you. And at the end of the day, you can't legislate friendships. You can't legislate people not being a bit pissed off with each other. But I think it's an important element in a free society, in a democratic society, just to make it as easy as possible. Try and expand the set of propositions that you can listen to without sort of defriending somebody.
I might play devil's advocate for one more moment here, and again, preempting something you've written in your article here. Some people listening may think, well, that's all fine and good, but what about that idea that we just disagree with each other, and you can't do much about this because it's infringement on each other's rights, and we actually want a society where we can disagree. Some people may be listening and say, well, what about that one person out there, or those few people out there who are not arguing genuinely, people who are actually ill-motivated in some way? What do we do about them? And of course, this also begins to touch on a question which you've written about as well, about hate speech laws. People will say these kind of protections are absolutely necessary to shut things down, and shut down not unpleasant ideas, so to speak, but bad motivations.
Well, who gets to decide what are the bad motivations? I mean, and
yes.
how can you tell? I mean, that's the crucial question, isn't it? Because this is also something that we've forgotten. And I mean, I think that at this point, it's incredibly biased. The public discourse and public institutions are incredibly biased in one particular direction. Now, I completely, I'm not trying to beat up on one side or the other, because I completely cede and acknowledge that if you go back 50 years or 70 years, the public discourse and public institutions were very biased in another direction. So we've always sort of had this problem. And if you go back hundreds of years, of course, people were being literally tortured and killed for believing in the wrong type of Christianity. But, whether it was, if you're in a Catholic area or a Protestant area, it was happening on both sides. But it's just part of the nature of political and religious arguments about things that people care about deeply, is that you often get into the situation where you're listening to someone else speak and you think, that's evil, that's a bad view, it's a dangerous view. I don't even understand how you could have that view if you weren't an ill-intentioned person. The important point is that that's the case for almost everybody, whatever side of the conversation you're on. So, it's equally, the people nowadays who are sort of part of the establishment, shall we say, it's very easy for them to say, oh, this person on the fringes is saying something that's evil, let's shut them down. But of course, the people on the fringes listen to them saying certain things and think that what they're saying is evil. And maybe if they had the power, they would shut them down. So you can get into this situation where we just have these cycles of domination. One side's in the ascendant, they shut the other side down. The other side's in the ascendant, they shut the other side down. That's not a healthy way to be. Also because, it's actually quite a healthy thing to have people push back on you in certain cases, right? So the much better solution is just to allow people to say what they want. You don't have to agree with them. At the end of the day, there's probably going to be a vote. One government's going to be in power and another isn't. But you don't have to prosecute them. You don't have to deplatform them. You don't have to unpublish their books.
That's on one last point on this freedom of speech before we dip back into Plato and begin to round it off. Another important reason for this, and you do preempt this in your article as well, is the question of piecemeal social engineering. And this is Popper's idea of how change should happen, not by huge grand revolution towards some perfect utopia, but by piece by piece by piece. And I have to assume that you think that, and of course this is what Popper thinks as well, that this is why freedom of speech is so important, so that we can actually make those small incremental changes. Not that we can just attack each other for the hell of it and for the fun of it, but because we actually need to make progress each day, piece by piece.
Precisely. I mean, this goes back to what I was saying before about the conjectures and refutations. I think that Popper saw politics as a kind of science. It's a kind of way of coming up with good propositions and good policies. And, you know, in order to do that, you need to be open-minded, and then we can move forward. I mean, I would also say that, you know, I think even Popper would say that the point about freedom of speech is more important even than the point about anti-utopianism. So the floor is open to people like Plato to step forward and publish a massive book saying we need to completely redesign everything. Popper himself wouldn't recommend that. I wouldn't recommend that. And hopefully in a sort of mature political culture, you get people then standing up and saying, come on, Plato, this is a bit crazy. You know, what are the costs involved with starting from scratch? You know, how are you going to train the philosopher kings, etc. And I think that for a lot of my life, you know, the 90s and 2000s, we did seem to be converging towards this view of, well, you know, unrestrained free market isn't the best thing. Some kind of state control of the economy isn't the best thing. Let's see where the sort of best solutions are, somewhere in the middle. And that's something else that I think we've lost. But I do think maybe we'll segue to this. I don't know if you're planning on doing that, but I do think that there are some things that Popper left out of his theory of democracy. Like, I think that he sees it very much as just about these conjectures and refutations. And I think there's a little bit more going on with it than that. For example, I think that political questions aren't just about what the best policies are, they're also about what people want to do. And I think that limited his democratic theory in a particular way, but I don't know if you want to get on.
No, let's get into that. So I have to assume, correct me if I'm wrong here, that you are following the line. So Popper had this theory of democracy in a very minimal way, that there's really very little content at all to Popper's understanding of democracy. It's almost a negative understanding, that it's simply the best way to remove bad leaders without violence and to do so as quickly as possible. And he deliberately, I think, left it open as to what that should be, because again, we can improve the best way to remove bad leaders. So I'm taking it's that you're taking some sort of a slight concern with. Yeah,
I mean, one thing to say about that is, so if you take this view, even if you take this view that politics is about conjectures and refutations, it seems like, I don't know if this is completely fair, but I think at certain points in his work, it seems to be the case that he's viewing this just as a matter of removing leaders. And then we might ask the question, well, why shouldn't the conjectures and refutations be actual policies? And if the conjectures and refutations are to do with actual policies, then we would move towards a more direct democratic system, right? Where people would actually be voting directly on individual propositions as in the sense of like, what are we going to do? Are we going to do X or Y? And that's actually closer to the system that the classical Athenians had, where they would have gone to the citizen assembly some 40 times a year and voted directly on propositions. So this, I think, is a little bit of a limitation of what Popper did with Plato. He was more concerned to defend, I think, liberalism against Plato than he was really to defend democracy. I think that if he had been more concerned to defend democracy in particular against Plato, he might have engaged more with the actual democracy that Plato was attacking, which is the classical Athenian democracy, which, as I say, was this very direct democracy. So I think that the democratic theory that Popper ended up promulgating was very similar to that of Joseph Schumpeter, who is a compatriot of Popper's, another Viennese exile who in this case went to the States. And Schumpeter's theory in his book, Socialism, Capitalism, and Democracy, is this sort of elite competition view of democracy, that democracy is really about which elite gets to be in power. And it's really just about sort of making sure that you can vote the bastards out. Now, the problem with that is just that you can actually have some version of you can actually have some system in which the bastards get voted out, or we can remove the bastards or the failing politicians without it being very democratic. So you could hypothetically imagine a system where there was some panel of experts and they had some criteria for success and failure, like GDP growth or whatever, or violation of certain human rights. And if the governing politicians did badly on those measures, the expert panel would remove them. So you can have the getting rid of the elite politicians without much democracy. And then the problem with that is just that in terms of history, it would seem to be the case that the most successful systems, the systems that have been most successful at defending against tyranny, have actually been the ones with the most popular involvement. And I think this is something, again, that it's interesting from the point of view of the history of liberal political thought, especially in Anglophone countries, that I think with people like George Grote, there's, and even with John Stuart Mill to an extent, there's still this sense that the so-called positive liberties and the negative liberties go together. In other words, our freedoms to do certain things, like to vote and to protest, they're the things that help us preserve our freedoms from various types of tyranny and abuse. And I think that Popper starts to move away from that. And in that sense, if in that sense only, he's more aligned to the more sort of libertarian thinkers like Hayek.
Because it's fun, let me play devil's advocate again here and try to channel Popper if he was alive and respond. And I imagine he might say something like this, that a direct democracy, so people have a referendum to vote directly in policies, would be a great thing. But what we kind of need for, if you're going to choose between any two theories, is advocacy. So if you think you have two particular policies and you're not sure which one you want, you need someone to argue for one side, like a court of law. And that may be why he thinks politicians have a role, and an important role here. Not that they infallible in some way, but that they actually believe in the policy that they're putting forward, and therefore will be the best advocate for that policy and then give us the best chance to make a decision.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's definitely something that goes on in the current system of representative democracy, that you have these advocates for certain views. But, I mean, why not let other people advocate for their views? I mean, this is a feature of classical democracy. Of course, classical democracy excluded women, and they had slaves and resident foreigners. We always have to remember that. But there's a passage in Plato's Protagoras where Socrates asks the intellectual Protagoras, why is it the case that the Athenians allow anybody to speak? You know, they when they have to consult people about shipbuilding, they will only allow the expert shipbuilders to speak. But when it comes to the questions of facing the polis, political questions about the city-state, they will allow anybody to stand up. And that includes shoemakers, potters. You know, Socrates is a bit incredulous that the democratic city allows all these people to speak, but you know, I think that often they should speak. And the thing is about advocates is political advocates, the political class, I mean, it often forms a particular stratum of the country, and they're not, doesn't mean they're necessarily terrible people, but it's just interesting that these effects often come about through elections, that the people who end up in parliaments and congresses tend to be richer than on average because it takes a lot of money to run for office in certain countries, and they'll also be better educated. And again, like some of these things you think they're not bad, but it does mean that sociologically they can turn out to be very different from the people that they're meant to be advocating for. So then you get these situations like in Britain where they had the Brexit referendum. Yes. And okay, the slight majority of people voted for Brexit, and you know, I actually abstained. I didn't have a huge dog in that fight. But after the election, it turned out that a significant majority of parliamentarians had voted Remain, and then they were meant to represent the views of people who voted Brexit. And I think in an ideal world, they would have found that easy. As it turned out, they found that very difficult to actually, you know, basically do what they were supposed to do, which was represent the people's views.
So let's wind this back to Plato and to Popper and to your article, and we can put some end and flourishes on this. And you write about Plato here. So you write that Plato would look around himself today and he would have very little that he would like about the democracies that he sees around us today. So I wonder how you see the current state of things, because I'm assuming if Popper were around today, he would also have plenty to dislike about the world around him. And as you mentioned there, those questions of freedom of speech would be quite prescient to Popper as well. So who do you think would be most happy today between the two? Because both, I imagine, would be miserably unhappy.
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I think that it's so hard to say, like, what would an ancient Greek have thought if you took him into the modern day? I think we would have just blown his mind. I mean, with all the differences, even though Plato was obviously a highly intelligent man. I think that, you know, in some ways, I think Plato wouldn't have been that unhappy, just in the sense that I do think that politics in the past few years has been becoming a little bit technocratic. And I think that Plato would have liked that. I mean, before we all started arguing about identity politics and free speech and stuff, there was a phase when we were arguing about sort of one of the things people were arguing about was the sort of China model, that China was governed by these technocrats. So people like Daniel Bell and Jason Brennan were writing books about how democracy has failed and what we need is a sort of technocratic elite that can guide policies. This is in the wake of the financial crisis, really. And I think Plato would have loved that. I mean, I think that basically Daniel Bell and Jason Brennan, who was in favor of the so-called epistocracy, rule of experts, they're basically Platonists. They're basically making the same arguments as Plato, which is to basically say, why have stupid people govern when you can have experts govern? So I think Plato wouldn't have been unhappy with that. I mean, obviously, we're not quite being ruled by philosopher kings, so Plato would not like that. He wouldn't like the aspects of democracy that we do have. I think Popper would be unhappy about the freedom of speech crisis. I think he would find that quite scary and disappointing after all that his generation had gone through, that we hadn't sort of learned the lessons from that. But I think other than that, I mean, the view of democracy that Popper had is pretty much the one that's still in place, where we just sort of get rid of certain politicians and we kind of, if we don't like them this year, then we get rid of them and then they have 4 more years to sort of do their thing. I think that one of the problems with the highly polarized environment at the moment is that it's become difficult to say that. I think in some ways the old left was very right about some things, and really a lot of the things that the left was saying about sort of liberating voices and bringing more people to come into the political conversation, giving marginalized groups more power, I think that's exactly right. We need to have more democracy, more radical democracy. But the thing that's often missed is that actually, in my view, that goes hand in hand with some of the more classical liberal and libertarian concerns of people like Popper. Because the negative liberties, as Oberlin put them, the liberties, the freedom from tyranny, the freedom from abuse, the freedom to have your voice heard without being shut down, those things are actually the flip side of the freedom to speak, the freedom to run for office, the freedom to be involved in politics. So I think we need to kind of reawaken that sense that liberty and democracy, although they can go in different directions, often they work very well in tandem, and we need to sort of push those two things, democracy and liberalism, together.
Throughout your article that I still have in front of me here, of course, it's a lot of the people that are criticizing Popper's book kind of doing so in a tone that runs something like, why is he focusing on Plato so much? Why, as you said, his attack, especially around historicism, is very applicable to Hegel and Marx. Perhaps it's more of a strain when it gets to Plato. And you write here, and this is perhaps the most interesting thing about this that I think people miss, is that he may have been focusing on Plato just because of how widely Plato was held at the time. And I might get you to think to explain this last part here, but this seems to be, at least in your mind, one of the most important things that Popper did for the world when he did attack Plato. And he wrote, Popper's most important contribution was bursting the bubble of the complacent Plato worship. And I might get us to touch on that before we finish here, that idea that he did a huge service to the world, that he did break that mindset of everyone. And I mean, I remember going back to my days as an undergraduate philosopher and everyone saying everything is a footnote to Plato and still repeating that phrase. And it seems that Popper did us a huge service by popping that bubble.
Exactly, yeah. And I'll say two things here. I mean, I think that it was very, very helpful to burst the bubble of veneration, which, okay, some people had attacked Plato before, but Popper did yeoman's work in that particular cause, and there was still a lot of Plato worship around in the 30s and 40s. And I think it's very, very important in an intellectual context when we're discussing ideas to reject reverence, to reject veneration, even veneration of Popper, actually. I mean, I think he was a great thinker and a great man, and I think he's right about a lot of very important things. But I also think it's important we can see various ways in which he went wrong in The Open Society and Its Enemies and in other works. So it's always important, I think, to be able to criticize figures that we have a tendency to put on a pedestal. The other thing I want to say, though, is having said that I do think that more recently there's been this tendency just to sort of completely tear down these figures and say they've got nothing good to say. And it's very important to realize what Popper was doing. He he was attacking Plato intellectually. He was attacking his ideas head on. He was attacking his ideas very, very aggressively. But Popper read his works very thoroughly, and he took care to make sure he wasn't, well, maybe people think he wasn't taking enough care, but his attempt, his sincere effort was to actually understand the arguments that Plato was making and to meet them on their own terms. He wasn't trying to sort of cancel Plato and say we shouldn't read Plato. And I actually come back to that point at the end of my essay as well, because, you know, I'm a classicist. It's not just a professional, it's not just a matter of sort of keeping classicists in work, but I will say that, you know, Plato is a great philosopher, and there's much more to Plato than just his political philosophy. And even his political philosophy is, in a sense, deep and fascinating. And, you know, the idea that we should have political experts, it's not something that only stupid people think. As I say, you know, these Jason Brennan, Daniel Bell in our own day have put forward these views. I mean, I think it's wrong, and it's dangerously wrong. But we need to take care to, you know, again, remember that freedom of speech is important. And even people who are putting forth views like Plato that we think are hostile to the open society, the most effective way of dealing with them, the most enlightened way of dealing with them, is to actually sort of give them that respect. So I hope that, you know, Popper will continue to be read, and I think he will. I also hope, and I actually have no doubt, that Plato will continue to be read. And when I teach Plato, I often find myself a little bit defending him nowadays and saying, you know, it's easy just to dismiss him and say, this guy's just a fascist. In the old days, of course, they would have said he was a communist. But anyway, nowadays, it's easy to say he's just a fascist, let's not read him. But, you know, there's a lot to do. There's a lot in Plato's thought that's very interesting and beautiful. And even his political philosophy, wrong though it is, I think is very intriguing.
Final question, and I might finish in the way that I started the podcast, talking about New Zealand, because you start your article with a quote from Michael King, and he says, "The Open Society and Its Enemies was the most influential book ever to come out of New Zealand." And you go on in this and another article of yours that I read. And of course, your podcast is called Free Kiwi, so it's very much focused on New Zealand in some ways, as well as much larger issues. But you go on to write, and this is you, "I want to reintroduce Popper to the current generation of New Zealanders." And as someone, I grew up, I mean, I'm Australian, but I've never been to New Zealand. And many people, as you say, may think of New Zealand as this very edge of the world. And they may have very little understanding of how Popper is regarded, or whether people in New Zealand even have an understanding that Popper has a legacy there, or that this book has a legacy there. So as a last question, how well are you doing reintroducing Popper to current New Zealanders, and how do current New Zealanders seem to appreciate or not appreciate that Popper at least has this history with their country?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, to be honest. It's funny because I've just done in my sort of peroration this whole thing about how we should not have too much veneration. But I will admit that Michael Johnson, my Free Kiwis co-host, and I, we did sort of think, well, you know, nowadays there's this big crisis with free speech, and you know, people don't always think completely in a sort of rational way, you know, in sort of propositions, conjectures and refutation type way. So maybe we could sort of co-opt Popper as a sort of great symbol of free speech, who was in New Zealand, and then that might be a way of getting people around that. And we wrote an article for the spin-off, which is sort of a sort of woke website, for lack of a better word. And we thought, okay, well, that'll help bring Popper's name to that particular, you know, demographic, which maybe needs it.
Yes.
But I'd say within the university, within the academic environment, I think that it's still the case that Popper is not sort of top of the list at the moment. He's not really the intellectual flavor of the month. Having said all that, I mean, I think New Zealand is still a very sort of decent place, and I sent my paper to. I gave this paper at a conference that my colleagues organized on the influence of Greek and Roman antiquity on New Zealand culture, and that's come out in a volume called Athens to Aotearoa. But it was very well received there, and then I sent it to the Journal of New Zealand Studies, and you know, they published it, and they seemed very happy about it. And it's very interesting because, as I say, like within the academy, if you say, I'm doing this paper on Karl Popper, your colleagues are kind of like, okay. And then I put it up on academia.edu, and it's sort of wildly popular. And I'm kind of surprised by this. And I published, papers to be honest, I've worked much harder on some of my historical papers on ancient Greece. And that they don't seem to have kind of caught fire in the same way. So it does seem to me that beyond the walls of the university, there's a huge interest in Popper. I don't know how much of that is coming from New Zealand per se, but outside, in the broader world, his ideas still have a lot of resonance. And you've got to remember that the fight for freedom and democracy, and even the most basic level, goes on in other countries through institutions like the Open Society Institute, founded by Popper's student Soros. And I think that there are a lot of people out there who's like that Chinese graduate student that we started with, who I think find a lot to be inspired by in Popper's ideas.
And of course, that is a wonderful note to end the podcast on, with that look back to the start. I can't think of a better way to finish the podcast. The article that I've been reading in front of me, and of course, as James just said, is linked on academia.edu, and I'm going to link that below for everyone, is called Karl Popper's Open Society and Its Enemies and Its Enemies. I'm going to link that below. It's not just an interesting read, it's actually a really enjoyable read, written incredibly well. So please go get your hands on that. You're not going to be disappointed. I'm also going to link below the link to James's podcast, Free Kiwis, and you can listen to that. I believe it is on YouTube, and you won't miss that link there as well. James Kierstead, thanks a lot for joining me on the podcast. It really has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.